Full disclosure up front. I'm an avid reader and writer for No Sleep, Creepypasta, SCP, and a few other outlets, and I have been for several years now. Horror is my bread and butter, and the majority of my free time is dedicated to trying to figure out the best ways to elicit chills, creeps, and nightmares in an attempt to craft a memorable and horrifying story. Writing is like breathing for me now, and I can't imagine life without it. If you've spent any amount of time on this channel or others like it, then odds are you've heard one of my stories at one point or another. I'll admit, most of those stories are fiction, as I'm sure most of you are well aware of, but this time it's going to be different. The story I'm about to share with you is unlike anything else that I've ever shared because it is real. I know it's cliche and not everyone will believe that, but truth be told, I'm not even really posting this to entertain anyone. I'm genuinely worried, and I could really use some advice. I won't give the name or link to my primary account because I don't want this associated with it in any way. There are people in real life who know me by that account, and I don't really want them to hear this, as this may strike a little too close to home. The names of those involved have been changed, but the events remain the same. The best place I can really think to begin this is when my younger sister passed away in 2015. She was born with a birth defect which left her unable to care for herself for her entire life. People with her diagnosis don't have long lifespans, and she passed away at just the age of 17 from pneumonia complications. This event was devastating for my family. We always knew that it would come one day, but you can never really be truly prepared to say goodbye. My parents separated not long after. My own depression struck harder than ever before, morphing into outright nihilism, but I think my brother Jake might have had it the worst. He suffered from sleep paralysis for much of his life, but after our sister passed, things really ramped up. He's described his experiences to me in a horrific detail multiple times. One event consisted of a large blob of black jelly which jiggled and pulsated around his room as he lay in bed, unable to move a muscle. It was almost comical in a way, but he clearly didn't think so. Another time, he recalls watching a long, slender humanoid creature with a split face crawl on the walls above and around him. He's also spoken of a little girl that will sometimes come and run around his bed and giggle. He says that she appears harmless, and sometimes he wonders whether she is an avatar of our deceased sister. He said that he's never seen her face, as it's always covered by a flowing head of dark brown hair, the same tint as our deceased sisters. There is one that he fears the most though, one that has visited him on multiple occasions. He calls it the Lurker. The Lurker does exactly what its name suggests. It lurks, usually out in the hallway or in his bedroom closet. He's never gotten a good look at its features and always describes it only as a human-shaped shadow. He's described it to me as feeling like he's being endlessly stalked by a tiger. Like somehow he knows the Lurker could attack him at any moment, but for whatever reason, it chooses not to do so. It's never approached him or caused him any harm. It just watches and waits. I've tried my best to approach this from a rational perspective. I suppose you could classify me as the stereotypical, skeptical ignoramus in a horror movie who tries to rationalize strange events with a reason, only to realize too late what is actually going on, as he's being disemboweled by Jason Voorhees. That's the thing though. That's how it is in movies and books. The rules of writing don't really apply in the real world. And if you ask me, I would say reality itself is not well written. There isn't always a satisfying character arc in real life, nor a stunning plot twist or any of the other thematic elements that comprise a great story. Sometimes bad stuff just happens, and there's no real rhyme or reason to it. I've spoken with Jake about his experiences on multiple occasions, as I find them equal parts fascinating as I do terrifying. I've always been interested in the human mind and the subconscious in particular. I thought maybe incidents of sleep paralysis and reports of supernatural phenomena are really just repressed traumatic memories finding other outlets. I'm sure that's the case in some instances, but I don't think everything can be explained so easily. I've done my best to assure Jake that nothing out of the ordinary is happening to him. I've offered theories that perhaps his incidents are stemming from internalized anxieties and deep-set traumas. He seemed to believe it for a while, but then something truly horrifying had happened. It was probably sometime past midnight when I heard my phone begin to ring. I woke up from my deep sleep and cursed the unknown caller as I reached for my phone. Between my fuzzy, sleep-laden eyes, I managed to make out a single word on my buzzing phone. Natasha. It was Jake's girlfriend at the time. Needless to say, it was rather odd that she was calling me in the middle of the night. Hello? Natasha was frantic, spitting words out on the other end of the line faster than my delirious mind could comprehend them. Tears dripped from every word, and terror resonated from her voice. Natasha, slow down. I can't understand you. I finally spoke. She took a deep, quivering breath and managed to mutter a sentence which made my blood drop to Arctic levels. Jake's on his way to the hospital. I lurched up in bed and asked her to explain what had happened. I'll try to summarize what she said as best as I can. Natasha and Jake lived in an apartment together at the time. She said that they were watching a movie in bed together, when all of a sudden Jake just started humming. Natasha thought that he was doing it just to annoy her, and after a few seconds, she lifted her head from his chest and pinched him on the side. He didn't stop. She told him to quit it, but Jake just kept humming. Natasha said that it sounded like the melody to a song, but she didn't know which one. Still thinking he was messing with her, she tried to push and get him to stop, but he didn't. He wouldn't react at all. She shook him and basically yelled at him to stop humming, but he wouldn't. She started to get really scared then, because nothing she did was able to wake him up. She rightfully panicked and called 911, and an ambulance showed up soon after. He had since stopped humming, but remained unresponsive. By this point in her explanation, I was already searching Expedia to try and find an immediate flight out to be there. Natasha then said that the EMTs performed a sternum rub on Jake before loading him up in the ambulance. For those who don't know, a sternum rub is a common practice used by paramedics to try to rouse a person who doesn't respond to verbal stimuli. They basically use their knuckles to apply pressure on the center of the chest. It's meant to be very uncomfortable and elicit pain, but it wasn't enough to wake up Jake. By this point, Natasha was in the ER room with several doctors and nurses and the still unconscious Jake. They had begun performing more intrusive tests to try and wake him up. They thought that he had gone into cardiac arrest, but all the tests that they ran came back negative. They inserted a catheter and even performed a spinal tap on him. From what I can understand, a spinal tap can be incredibly painful on an unconscious person. Normally, the procedure is done when the person is awake, but during sleep, the muscles are relaxed, which can cause more pain. I could be wrong about all that, so feel free to correct me in the comments if any medical professionals are reading this. But either way, neither the catheter nor the spinal tap was enough to wake up Jake. I've never felt so helpless in all my life, and I could do nothing but listen from the other end of the phone 1,000 miles away. Thankfully, my dad lived near Jake at the time, and he arrived at the hospital not long after they did. The medical staff continued to swarm in to try and determine what was happening to Jake, but every test they ran came back negative. His vitals were stable, and system devoid of any sort of drugs that were screened for. They either gave him a CAT scan or an MRI, but I honestly can't remember which one it was. And that's when they actually found something unusual. His frontal lobe and pineal gland were lighting up like crazy. Natasha said that one of the doctors even described it as glowing like a Christmas tree. Jake was still unconscious, and my mother, who also lived very far from them, had been informed on what was happening by that point. My parents were not on good terms at the time, and in a way had become polar opposites. After my sister had passed, my mother had doubled down on her religious faith, whereas my father had abandoned it entirely. Jake apparently had started humming again and spoke several words at random. Destroy, tree, macaroni, and go away being among them. My mom and dad put aside their post-marital discord then in favor of trying to help their son. My mom then suggested something which my dad outright refused at first. She suggested praying. I know there are many out there who would scoff at this idea as well, and honestly, if I had been there that night, I might have too. A medical emergency like that may seem counterintuitive to prayers, but by that point, the options were running thin. Natasha was a very superstitious girl as well, and she had begun to worry that Jake was being attacked by some demonic entity after the doctors ruled pretty much everything else out. Reluctantly, my father finally agreed and put his hand on my brother's forehead. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, I command you to leave my son alone. He all but screamed the words through tears. Silence then befell the room, and Jake fell still. He took a deep breath, and his eyes then opened. I could hear the sense of relief in the room from the other end of the phone, as Jake glanced around the room in utter confusion. I gotta pee so bad. That was the first thing he said upon waking up, to the laughter and relief of many who were present. He told me later that he's never had to pee so bad in his life, and Jake was obviously confused as to why he was in the hospital. After talking with him afterwards, he says that he remembers going to bed that night and nothing else. He doesn't remember any dreams, or any of the tests or anything else that transpired while he was unconscious. Doctors had no idea how to explain what happened, and simply classified it as an unexplained sleep anomaly. Apparently, one of the nurses attending to Jake had burst into tears after my dad spoke his command. She didn't say anything, and just excused herself from the room, clutching her cross necklace tightly in her hand. No one was more bewildered than my dad, however, and to this day, he doesn't know what he witnessed that night. Now, to any atheists and agnostics reading this, please don't write me off as someone trying to simply convert others into a particular way of thinking via the illustration of satanic powers or something like that. Truth be told, I have no idea how to explain what happened that night either. I've always wondered whether things like exorcisms and demonic forces are truly legit. I've thought perhaps those words of power used by my dad that night were more significant on a cognitive level than they were spiritual. Like maybe the words were recognized by Jake's auditory subconscious and used to sort of trigger him into waking up. Like I said earlier, I try to maintain a healthy dose of skepticism while leaving all possibilities open, and I hope neither side of the religious debate scorns me too greatly for it. I just want answers. Jake has never had another incident quite like that night. He's had periodic episodes of sleep paralysis, but thankfully, nothing as extreme as that night. He has a regimen that he sticks to now, like avoiding sleeping on his back, leaving a nightlight or his TV on, and avoiding using sleeping pills, which have greatly reduced his sleep paralysis episodes. About a year after this all happened, Jake and Natasha decided to move out to where I live, after some relentless persuasion on my part. They moved into the house with myself and my two good friends, and we've been living together ever since. I think it's necessary to explain a bit about Natasha at this point. She was quite high-strung, controlling and jealous, with traits that may even be considered emotionally abusive. I wouldn't admit this to Jake, but I never really liked her that much. And I'm not the only one to share this opinion. Female friends of mine have confided that they weren't huge fans of her either. Honestly, I thought living with her was going to be a nightmare, but didn't really care because I wanted my brother out here. She actually surprised me though, and they fit into our household quite nicely. All 5 of us got along well, and it was actually a pretty natural transition. They lived with us for months and things were pretty good. One night I was just settling in for bed watching Trailer Park Boys for like the 1000th time when someone knocked on my door. I told them to come in, and Natasha opened the door a moment later. I could tell by the look on her face and her fidgeting hands that she was nervous. "Hey," she said. "Hey, is everything okay?" I asked. She fumbled with her phone for a moment and managed to spit the words out. "Can you come look at Jake? He's humming." My heart immediately dropped in my chest and I leapt up to go to the room. Jake was in bed, humming quietly. Like Natasha had said before, it sounded like the melody to a song. Jake is an aspiring musician, so he's always writing music. And I thought maybe that was him dreaming up a new one because I didn't recognize the melody either. My mind immediately shot back to the night when he went to the hospital, but this time I could do something about it. I went over to him and shook his shoulder, telling him to wake up. My soul breathed a sigh of relief as he stirred awake a moment later. What's up?" he asked groggily. Not wanting to worry him, I decided to improvise an answer. "Hey, you were snoring really loud. You feel sick?" I asked. No, I'm fine," he replied. I gave him one of my breathe rights because I thought maybe his nostril was partially restricted at night. I'd been told by several annoyed ex-girlfriends that I snore like a wild hog trying to suck a tennis ball through a garden hose, and those things always helped me, so I thought maybe they would help him. He went back to sleep and Natasha and I kept an eye on for him for a while. After being confident that the humming was gone, I eventually returned back to my room. The next morning, Jake left for work early. I had the day off that day and was just sipping my morning coffee when Natasha came downstairs. We greeted each other as usual and she began making herself food in the kitchen as I scrolled Reddit and YouTube. After lingering in silence for a couple minutes, she finally told me something disturbing. Jake and her shared the master bedroom, and they had a small crucifix hanging on the wall. Apparently, when Natasha woke up that morning, she found the crucifix flipped upside down. It was like a cliche straight out of a horror movie, but it was quite unnerving to hear. To be completely honest though, I didn't know if I believed her. Once again, I tried using logic to say that maybe the crucifix had swiveled on the nail, and its weight made it flip upside down. Natasha did have a way of exaggerating things. I don't think she meant to lie necessarily, but she did spice up stories to emphasize whatever she was trying to convey. I mean, lots of people do it after all, but either way, Natasha was clearly shaken up by it. It's probably necessary at this point to talk a bit about our lovely neighbor to the west. She's a woman probably in her late 50s, lives alone with her cats, and has been nothing but a pain in the butt since we moved in. Everyone in the neighborhood knows her and no one likes her as far as I can tell. We've had multiple confrontations with her by this point and none of them friendly. She's yelled profanities at us, called the police on us at least half a dozen times, and has just generally been an awful neighbor. She also has a rather annoying habit of leaving her trash can out on the road at all times so that one of us has to either park elsewhere or exit our vehicle to move her trash can out of the way. We do our best to avoid engaging with her in any way, and it only seems to encourage her spiteful efforts. One thing that I've always found odd is her unusual manner of insults that she's hurled at us. She of course has accused us of being drug dealers and users, among other baseless accusations. But one day, she accosted me with a unique insult after I had the nerve to unload groceries from my car. "You are all devil worshippers." I just ignored her and literally didn't speak a word back, but I found her insult rather bizarre. Just to clarify, we are not in fact devil worshippers, and I promise there's no plot twist coming at the end about that being the case. I found that insult oddly specific though. Like, who insults someone like that? Unless maybe she has a guilty conscience. It sort of reminded me about how you would hear those stories sometimes of a staunch evangelical pastor leading a crusade against narcotics, only for it to come out later that the same pastor has been caught smoking crack outside a 7-Eleven. It's the age-old tactic of accusing others of that which you yourself are guilty of. I don't know whether that woman, who we have nicknamed Karen, has or had anything to do with what's been happening, and honestly, I'll probably never know. On her best days, she wouldn't sit to talk with me about any of this, and I have all but abandoned the notion. I have sometimes entertained the notion, however, as ridiculous as it may seem to some, of whether she may have put some sort of hex on us. Ever since we bought the house in 2017, I've had this odd feeling. I've attributed it mostly to stress of a mortgage and work, but I've always felt as though there is some shadow lingering around me. I'm not the only one to have that feeling either, as my roommates have confessed to similar feelings. One of my roommates, a longtime friend of mine, who I'll call Sean, told me that he had been suffering with nightmares periodically since we had moved in. He hasn't gone into much detail about them, but he has clearly been disturbed by them. He actually stayed with his parents for about a month at one point, because the nightmares had gotten so bad. As for me, I've been struggling as of late. As we all know by now, in 2020, it was a crap year, but 2019 was probably even worse for me. It might even be the worst year of my life. In April of that year, I was at work when a sudden pressure began to build up in my chest. I thought it was just a muscle ache, but then it grew and a terrible sense of dread descended upon me. My chest was throbbing, hands trembling and mind racing. It felt like the world was just closing in around me, and I was certain that I was about to die. I didn't know what was happening, and after trying to walk it off for nearly an hour, and being scolded by my supervisor, I finally asked them to call 911. I'm thankful they did so with great urgency, and my coworker even offered to drive me to the ER. I took him up on the offer, but we only got like half a mile down the road before I asked him to pull over so I could pace around. That was the only thing that seemed to bring some relief. As we waited for the ambulance, I called my parents and brother to tell them what was happening and that I loved them. The ambulance arrived soon after and took me to the hospital. I thought that I was having a heart attack, but thankfully it was confirmed by doctors to only be a panic attack. I say only because these events are not and cannot be fatal, but to anyone who deals with these things, please know that I do not in any way mean to diminish how difficult or terrifying they are to cope with. Nothing has been the same since that day. I took off like 2 weeks from work because I just felt utterly consumed by panic after the event. I thought that I was going insane, or stricken by a deadly disease of some kind. Every little sensation in my body, from my headache to the urge to crap, suddenly became an indication to me that something was very wrong with me. It was like I had suddenly forgotten how to live, and every minuscule sensation in my body became a threat. I spent thousands of dollars in medical expenses that year and made a total of 13 trips to the doctor and 3 to the ER. I had EKGs, blood work, ultrasounds, x-rays, MRIs, and pretty much every other medical test that there is. Luckily, things have all come back as normal, but it hasn't relinquished the panic. Eventually, they diagnosed me with an anxiety condition known as panic disorder. I also lost my job because of all of this, and began to really struggle financially, which of course only made the anxiety and depression worse. This diagnosis is hell, and I wouldn't wish it upon my worst enemy. Luckily, I've made some definite improvements lately, thanks in large part to the regimen of antidepressants that I began in October, coupled with CBT and other coping mechanisms. That wasn't the only reason why 2019 was so terrible, however. A good friend of mine, Chris, who I have known for many years, had left for the military some time ago. 2019 was his discharge year, and he seemed eager to get out. I communicated with him occasionally in the months leading up to his release, and I couldn't wait to see him again. August finally rolled around, and he made the long drive back from the eastern United States to our house on the west coast of the US. We of course told him that he could live with us, as we had a spare bedroom which seemed like the perfect fit. He finally arrived, and he was the same old friend he had been before he left. We had a party with all of our friends, and everyone was thrilled that he was back. In the following weeks, he moved into our house, and we all got along great. He actually took it upon himself to reseed the grass in our front yard and do other maintenance on the house. He was always like that, determined with an iron code that seemed to compel him to think of others before himself. He seemed to be living large. He started dating an old friend of ours, went out skydiving, and just seemed to be absolutely thrilled to be home. He was working part-time and expressed interest in enlisting in the Special Forces and another branch of the military. He was jacked too. He had clearly been hitting the gym hard for some time. He seemed like he was in the best physical shape of his life, but looks can be cruelly deceiving. He was drinking quite a lot, but not to the point where it really interfered with his daily activities. We didn't think that it was an issue, as our group has always binge drank like that. I remember one day he approached me with a really odd interaction. He had an impressive collection of pocket knives, machetes, and swords that he had been gathering for years. I was playing Smash Bros. Ultimate on the couch when he came and dropped like 5 pocket knives on the couch beside me. I shot him a confused look, and he just smiled. "Do you want these?" he asked. My confusion only mounted. "You don't?" I asked, slightly bewildered. "Nah, I've got so many already." I took a break from the game and inspected the knives. They were really nice, and I imagine they costed quite a bit. I found it odd that he had apparently decided to just give them to me out of the blue like that. "You really don't want them?" I asked again, and he again assured me that he just had too many, and I graciously accepted his gift, thinking little else of it. Things went on as usual, with all of us working and doing the usual, and Chris struggled to find full-time employment, but did work part-time with a family friend of ours doing landscaping. We all had varying schedules, and during the work week we didn't tend to see a whole lot of each other. Nathan, the other friend in our house who had been there since the beginning, worked early mornings and usually left at around 4 a.m. Sean had the closest thing to a 9-to-5, and generally left the house at around 7. I worked swing and didn't start till 3 p.m., and my brother Jake worked nights beginning at 10 p.m. Natasha was a barista, so her schedule was sort of all over the place and it changed regularly. One night on my off day, I was at home once again playing Smash in the living room. Sean was in the other room by the kitchen watching TV, and Chris was upstairs in his room. We were all just doing our thing, when there was suddenly a popping sound that echoed from the house. It sounded like somebody had dropped a beer bottle onto a hardwood floor or something. I asked Sean if he had done it, but he hadn't. Once again, none of us thought much of it. I went to the doctor the next day to deal with all my imaginary ailments, and when I returned home, I found something that caught my eye. Chris's Jeep hadn't moved from the night before. Once again, I just thought that he hadn't bothered leaving the house for whatever reason. Maybe he was sick or just chilling out. I went to bed at around 11 that night and saw something else which increased the anxiety. His bedroom light was still on. Me and Jake were generally the night owls of the house, and everyone else tended to go to sleep before us due to our schedules. I found it kind of odd that Chris was still awake, I thought about knocking on his door, but I ended up not doing so. I felt really nervous going to bed that night, but since I almost always felt nervous, I just attributed it to the anxiety. The next morning, as I sauntered out of my room, something familiar and unsettling caught my eye. Chris's bedroom light was still on, and his door still shut. I felt my heart sink in my chest, but I tried talking myself down and doing CBT to calm myself. By the way, the acronym CBT in this context is cognitive behavioral therapy, and not something else which cultured, degenerate individuals may misconstrue. Mornings always seem to elicit a lot of anxiety with me, and so, once again, this day wasn't really anything different in that regard. I began brewing coffee and Sean emerged from his room shortly after. He and I joked and talked as we did on pretty much every morning. The thought arose to go check on Chris, and I was about to ask Sean to go with me, but I chickened out and Sean left for work shortly after. For the next hour or so, I was on the brink of panic and tried desperately to quell the mounting storm in my chest. I paced around the ground floor endlessly, hoping and praying that I would hear Chris's footsteps upstairs. I even thought that I did at one point, but clearly that was just my imagination. A car rolled into the driveway a bit later. The front door then opened and in stepped Jake, who had just gotten off work. He and I greeted each other with our routine insults and banter, and just talked as usual. He was about to head up to bed when I finally forced the question from my throat. "Hey, have you seen Chris lately?" I asked. Jake paused and turned on the stairs as he thought. "No, not since Monday." "Why?" he asked. I then nervously explained how I hadn't seen him in a while either. He suggested that we go check on him, as the worst that we thought could happen was him waking up and being annoyed. I've never been so wrong in my life. We crept up the stairs towards his room and I placed a gentle knock on his door. I called his name, but there was no response. My heart felt like it was about to spring right out of my chest as I slowly pushed the door open. I saw him immediately seated in his chair by the desk in the corner. For a brief millisecond, I felt relief, seeing him sleeping in his chair. But he wasn't sleeping. His head was slumped back against the wall, and eyes wide open staring upwards. It all struck me in an instant. I screamed his name and rushed towards him, knowing immediately that it was futile, but still pressing my finger to his neck and praying that I would feel a pulse. His skin was cold and rigid, feeling more like rubber than it did skin. There was a wound on his head, and a spackling of blood on the wall. His skin was pale and I knew right away that it was far too late. The following minutes consist of mostly a blur. I called 911 and then our two roommates and I scarfed down a couple Ativan to try and contain the typhoon raging in my chest. I was crying and whimpering as I made my way back upstairs. Jake was just slumped against the opposing wall directly outside Chris's room, staring blankly at the macabre sight like his mind didn't know how to process what it was witnessing. There was this haunting, distant gaze in his eyes that I don't think I can ever forget. I just leaned down and hugged him, as he screamed and cursed at the top of his lungs, anger mixing with sorrow as he questioned why Chris would do something like that. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later, and I did my best to whimper out what we found. They went up to the room and grimly confirmed what we already knew. Chris was gone. Our two roommates arrived a few minutes later, followed soon after by Chris's family. That day was a nightmare, a living, visceral nightmare that refused to end. Hugs were exchanged, tears were shed, and worlds were changed forever. Chris had ended his own life. Apparently, the pistol he used was resting right in his lap, but in the shocking frenzy, I hadn't even noticed it. Sean and I later talked about the popping noise that we had heard 2 days previous. We had been around guns all of our lives, and needless to say, we know what a gunshot sounds like. but that didn't sound like one. I guess it had to have been muffled by something. Everyone was devastated, and even now I can still hardly believe it actually happened. Part of me feels like I'm just writing another story now, as I've done dozens of times before. And a larger part of me wishes desperately that was the case, but it isn't. We all love horror, I mean, that's why we all read and listen to these stories, right? The cold chills that creep down your spine, and the goosebumps that line your skin as you read or listen are addictive feelings. It's a dark world, and we are the ones who seek the shadows. The horror that I witnessed that day is unlike anything that I've ever felt. I sincerely hope that you, whoever you are that is reading this, never have to see something like I saw that day. The fictitious stories that we spend hours crafting and refining will never amount to that which can occur in real life. I would like to say that all of this is behind us now and that things are all peachy keen nowadays, but that isn't true. Several members of my friend group have expressed the idea that they believe we are cursed or of some variation of that. We had a cat and a dog in our house, and I would often catch them staring at nothing while on full alert. People seemed uncomfortable in our house after Chris's passing. Obviously, everybody knew that was where he had done it, and that alone is enough to warrant anxiety. But it seemed to be more than that. We had a barbecue months later, and all of our friends came over with their kids. One of the young girls ended up going upstairs and into Jake and Natasha's room. No one knows what exactly happened, but at some point her mom realized that she was missing. We found her soon after in Jake and Natasha's walk-in closet. She was crying and looked absolutely terrified when they found her. She ran out and jumped into her dad's arms, and he comforted her. He asked her what had happened, but she refused to speak. He later told me that she later told him that she was hiding from the tall, dark man. Apparently, the kids had been playing hide and seek when she saw a tall, dark man like a shadow that crawled up from under Jake's bed and chased her into the closet. Now, it could just be an exaggerated story from the mind of a scared child, but according to her parents, she's never done anything like that before. A few months after Chris had passed, my roommate Nathan and I had a worrying experience one night too. I was downstairs cooking nachos when suddenly, a shrill, ear-piercing shriek of terror reverberated in the night. At first, I thought it was Nathan watching a horror movie upstairs, but a second later he came scampering down the stairs. "Did you hear that?" he asked, eyes wide as he clutched his pistol. We convened for a moment and realized these screams sounded like it had come from Karen's house next door. We turned off all the lights and grabbed our guns to hunker down. We were worried that someone had broken into our house. We waited around in the silent dark for several minutes, but never heard anything beyond that initial scream. As the minutes passed, we finally decided to call the police and have them do a welfare check. I did just that, and the police arrived several minutes later as we waited. Nathan was at the front door and I was at the back looking over the fence into her yard. I heard them knocking on her door and the subsequent sounds of them speaking, but I was too far to make out what was said. After only about a minute, I saw the cops walking away and heard Karen shut her door behind them. Nathan and I breathed a sigh of relief, but before we could reconvene, I heard her sliding glass door open on the other side of the fence. "Screw you, you'll never take me." She just screamed it out into the night. Nathan and I immediately busted out laughing, now convinced that nothing was actually amiss. Nathan made a joke about her being angry at her cats, and we just laughed. The vindictive behavior of this woman after we had the nerve to check and make sure that she was safe was something that we honestly should have expected by that point, based on the way she's always treated us. It was a weird phrase that she had used though, and at the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I don't know if it's related, but that night, I had probably the worst nightmare of my entire life. As dreams often have a way of doing, the memory seems to have mostly disintegrated from my mind now. I just remember suffering and horrific visions of violence to loved ones and other unspeakably horrible things. I woke up utterly frantic, drenched in sweat and gasping for breath. I felt like someone had been trying to strangle me in my sleep, and my windpipe seemed partially restricted. As I stumbled my way into the bathroom trying to calm myself down, I flicked on the lights and proceeded to sear my eyeballs in their sockets. My eyes took a while to acclimate to the light, and once they had, I saw something. I'm still not 100% on this, and after all, I was half awake and partially blind while suffering a panic attack. But I swear that I saw a face looking back at me from outside at the bathroom window. A horrible face, gaunt and humanoid, but ambiguous as though concealed in shadow. The sudden sight of it caused me to fall back into the door. I rubbed my eyes furiously, and once they finally cleared, I saw nothing. Nothing but an empty window and the darkness beyond. I don't know what that thing was or whether it was even there. I have no history of hallucinations, but I suppose the sudden awakening and lethargy may have done something. I swear that I saw it though, and no matter how I've tried to rationalize it, it doesn't feel right. At certain other points I've seen it too, or at least thought I did. It's always out of the corner of my eye or some obscured position off in the distance. That's always the problem with these things. They're always vague and never anything irrefutable. Jade told me a few concerning things lately as well. He works a graveyard at a local deli, and a few nights ago, he was in the freezer when he was suddenly struck by a feeling of impending doom. He said he felt as though every one of his primal senses were screaming at him to leave immediately, but he didn't understand why. He turned to exit the freezer when he saw the door slowly creep shut, and between the cracks, he saw a dark silhouette for a split second. A dark silhouette of something that he recognized. The lurker. Up to now, this thing has been confined only to his nightmares, and this was the first time that he had seen it in the waking world. He described it pretty much exactly as he had before. A human-shaped shadow that lurks. But this time it appeared to intentionally try to harm him. At least if he saw what he thought he did. The freezer door at his work is specifically designed to prevent closing automatically. It also has a feature to prevent from locking when someone is inside. It's good that they have that too, and Jake was able to get out without an issue aside from being rather unnerved. He admitted to me recently that he's wondered whether he could be schizophrenic, and that thought terrifies me, but another one weighs almost as heavy. Even if he does have some sort of mental condition, that doesn't explain how the door shut behind him like that, or how he and I both seem to see similar things. Thankfully, this seems to be about it for now. As of late, neither I nor Jake nor anyone else has had any weird experiences. As you can imagine, all these worrying things weighed heavy on us for a while, since this is real life and not a horror movie. We sold the house and moved out at the end of 2022, and thankfully everyone seems to be doing better now, but the haunting memories still remain. And that's about where we're at now. The writer in me almost hates to leave things off like this. Every story that I write has to have a conclusion or an explanation, or at the very least enough pieces for the reader to surmise the truth. But this post doesn't have that. We don't always get resolutions in real life, and that fact troubles me a lot. A lot of what we've experienced could be pinned on mental health, but can all of it? If spirits exist, then how do we draw the line between their influence and that of our own subconscious inner workings? Can an episode of Psychosis explain why a freezer door shut on its own like that? Can schizophrenia explain why an invocation of Jesus Christ awoke my brother when all other medical options had failed? I find it interesting that people often refer to mental health issues as demons, and now I wonder whether there is a much more literal interpretation of that. Since we moved, a few of my friends have told me in confidence that they could sense an ominous aura whenever they were at our house. It breaks my heart to be honest, as I've always hoped my home would be a welcoming place of comfort for everyone, but clearly that was no longer an option. If anyone out there has ever experienced anything like this or has any theories, then please feel free to share them. And for those of you out there who suffer with depression and suicidal thoughts, I am begging you with all that I am, please don't do it, no matter whether you believe it or not. Since Chris has passed, I have seen people come to share their condolences that I didn't even know knew him. My Facebook inbox was overwhelmed by people showing their support and wishing me well. Please don't do it to yourself. You cannot imagine what you do for those you leave behind. The wounds that never heal, and you will never be forgotten. If anyone has any advice, then I would greatly appreciate hearing it. And if anything more happens, then I will update everyone. Here's to hoping that doesn't happen though. I just want us all to be okay again.